Tracie is going to come share her testimony with us about a storm in her life that I was not present for, but I have been able to pull encouragement from her storm. So please welcome Tracie as she shares her story with us tonight.
Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. Most of you may know me from church because I get up and sing on Sunday mornings, and I'm really pretty well incredibly comfortable with that activity, and I don't think too much about it. Speaking is something I don't do nearly as often, so do get a little nervous about that. So very encouraged by the crowd tonight, but now the marketing for this event was fabulous. So a couple Sundays ago, I get here and the posters have arrived. And I'm walking from one building to the next, and everywhere I look, I'm seeing my face. And I'm walking with Deborah Purrier, and she says to me, "Wow, Tracie, seen a lot of you already today." And I said, "Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of these." And then we walk into the bathroom, and there's one on the bathroom wall. And I said, if I see one more of those, I'm going to scream. And I go into the bathroom stall and said, "Ah!" I looked at Deborah. I said, "I haven't seen my name on this many bathroom stall walls in a long time." I said, so this was really well publicized, and so thank you all for coming out tonight. So I'm excited to get to share my story. It's a story, and it's mine, and so I'm excited to get to share that with you tonight. And I've had the opportunity to share this story with a few different groups in the past, and Jill Lowry allowed me to share it through her podcast last year. How many of you have heard that podcast? Let's start. Okay, we all can go home. I promise I'll add a couple of things to it tonight. But that podcast was exciting for me. I've gotten to share it a few times through some different activities I've had with work, believe it or not. And it's been a door opener for me in a lot of different ways. However, I have always shared that story with a room full of strangers. And tonight, that's a little different too. How many of you knew me in 2002? Yeah, they're the ones that are making me nervous tonight. I told someone earlier, I said, usually when I tell this story, it's my story and I can tell it how I want to. Tonight, there are people here who can stand up and go, "Wait a minute, I don't think that's exactly how that happened." But I'm going to stand by the fact this is my story and I'll tell it how I want to. But So to tell you a little bit about me, you got to go back a little further than 2002. I was born to two Christian parents with Christian grandparents. Went to church at Greenwood Baptist Church from the time they could get me out of the house to take me somewhere. Was saved and baptized when I was 9 or 10 years old. Not a lot of life happening up to that point. And when I was a senior in high school, I got the opportunity to go on a mission trip with a group of ladies, or a group of girls, and some very special counselor ladies from the First Baptist Church in Winsboro. And we were sitting around a campfire one night preparing for that mission trip, and the girl that I was paired with, we usually referred to as God's wife, because she was perfect and she never did anything wrong. And we get to laughing, trying to share our testimony with each other. And our counselor, whose name was Helen Decker, came over to me, and we just called her Hell, and she said, "What are you laughing at?" And I said, "Hell, we don't have a testimony." I said, our testimony's kind of boring. And she looked at us dead serious, never cracked a smile, and said, "Be careful, because God will give you a testimony." And he did. So and I always thought of that throughout everything that's happened in my life. When something really significant happens, I have to stop and think, yeah, this is God giving me my testimony. So my testimony didn't start and stop with my baptism. My testimony is my life. And so the longer we go, the more we add to our testimony. So I was raised Christian home, had watched my parents have pretty much a, picture perfect marriage in my eyes. Had never been in any significant trouble. Everything had gone good. I went and then moved to Longview after college and met a guy. I mean, this is what you're supposed to do, right? You're 20 years old. You're supposed to meet the guy. So I meet the guy. He's the great guy. Never been treated better. I mean, he was good looking. He was friendly. He was kind. He loved my family, my friends. I mean, he just mixed right in with us. It was great. 6 months after knowing this guy's name, I married him. If you're young and single, wasn't the smartest move I made for sure. 6 months is a little short for most people. But I thought, this is the guy. He's the one. So we marry in October. And then in February, after October, Sunday night, we chose not to go to church. We're sitting at home. He went somewhere to get gas or whatever and got stopped by a local Mount Vernon cop at the stop sign in Saltillo. And their computers were down. And so they told him, give us your driver's license number and we'll check it later. We'll go ahead and let you go. So they let him leave. Now, this is God moment number 1 in my story. He gets home and he tells me that he was stopped by the cop. And we kind of laugh about it and on we go. Well, a little while later, there's a knock at my door. And Officer Brian Gurley, was standing at my door and said he needed to talk to my husband. And I said, why? And he said, well, I have a warrant for his arrest. And I said, for what? And he said, parole violation. And I looked at Brian. I said, Brian, you can't be on parole unless you go to prison first. And he said, uh-huh. And so up to this point, my husband is still telling me they've got the wrong guy. Got the wrong guy. So Brian knows me well enough that he's making some phone calls and asking some people to bring some information. And so they bring out the warrant with a picture from the Texas Department of Corrections of him in his prison suit. Here he is. And so at that point, he has to admit to me, yes, I've been to prison. So they take him away. And I call my mother, and she's at church. So I had to wait till I got out of church. We finally get together. We figure out what's going on. We're trying to put a story together. The next day, I finally get to go in and see him. And I go in and I sit down in front of him, and I said, why would you lie to me about this part of your past? I mean, if it's really a part of your past and you're really not this guy anymore, why wouldn't you just tell me? And he looked at me with the best lie I've ever heard and said, if I had told you, would you have ever gone out with me? And I said, well, no. And he said, well, that's why I lied. I mean, perfectly good explanation, but he's not that guy anymore. He's turned over a new leaf. He's different. So, okay, so I let him come home. After about 3 months of him being in a program for parole violators, he gets to come home, and we're going to make a life, and we're going to make this work. Because during that time, in my heart, in my prayers, I felt like I had married him. I had fallen in love with him and felt like he was the right one, not knowing, and maybe he was right. If I had known, would I've ever given him a chance? So I'm going to let him come home, and we're going to try this again. So he comes home, and we try this again, and he can't tell me the truth about anything. And so I finally figured out that I couldn't do this anymore. So God moment number 2. I call my mother to tell her that I have a problem and I need out. And he's very clingy. He wouldn't leave me alone. I mean, I had to send him to the grocery store to even be able to call Mom to tell her. But I called Mom that night, and she says, oh, Tracie, I'm so glad you called. And I said, why? She said, because I've been going through the bank statements today, and I have figured out that he is taking money out of mine and Daddy's check account. And I didn't know how in the world I was going to tell you because I was afraid you wouldn't want to believe it. And I said, no, I know. And I said, so what are we going to do? And she says, well, we're going to call Daddy. And so Daddy was out of town. And Dad said, don't do anything till I get home. So I wait for him to get home. We get to talking to the police. We're talking to the divorce attorney. We're trying to figure out how we're going to make all this work out perfectly. The cops are asking us, please hold off, because if you file divorce paperwork on him, he's going to run, and we're not going to be able to catch him, and we want to be able to file all this at the same time. So I went home every night and cooked this man supper. And went to bed and slept a lot. And so finally, he came and he took me to lunch at work one day, and he was agitated. And I could tell he had been to the bank, and the bank teller wouldn't give him any money. Well, the bank teller was in on it, so she knew what was going on, and so she just wouldn't let him have any cash. And he knew something was up, and he just knew, I could tell something wasn't right. And I called my dad, I watched his car drive away, and I called my dad from the office, and I said, he's on to something. If he leaves and we don't get those divorce papers filed, we may never see this guy again, and I am tied to this guy. We got to get out. So he made some phone calls, called our lawyer. Lawyer said, well, I don't have anybody to serve the papers today. Dad said, the Hawkins County Sheriff's Department's going to serve the papers. And he said, sir, the Sheriff's Department doesn't serve divorce papers. They served mine. And so they sent, I think, 3 squad cars up the driveway. It was quite a dramatic moment. I was still at work, so I missed all of that fun. And sure enough, just like the cops had told us he would, he ran. And that started 28 days of absolute turmoil and stress and fear and all of the things that happen in a storm. He had never been abusive to me. He had never said a cross word to me. He had never laid a finger on me. He had never done any of those things. But the minute that he left, he changed. And that's when the harassment started, the phone calls. I got hundreds of phone calls a day. I have hours of messages that we taped off the answering machine. Don't laugh at the age of this story, but we had hours because we were preparing for trial. You know, we knew we were fixing to have to try to put this guy in jail, and so we were saving all of these things. We had hours of messages. He had threatened our lives. He had threatened my parents' lives. He threatened my dog. I mean, you name it, he had made a threat. He bomb threatened the agency where I worked at the time. That was fun when I got that phone call in the middle of the night because my insurance agent that I worked for, bless his heart, had gotten a call from the police that he had bomb threatened the agency. So everything you can imagine, just nitpicking at us constantly, and we got no rest. So then we were trying to figure out how we were ever going to get him, lined up and trapped and back in the thing when another God moment came up. We're sitting at home one afternoon, and the phone rings, and it's Nelda. Nelda waved back here in the back. This is Nelda. Nelda was a lifelong friend and our neighbor. And some guy in Bunkie, Louisiana. If you don't know where Bunkie is, go to New Orleans and go south. Bunkie, Louisiana had called her fairly angry because someone had stuck a pickup truck in his cane field in South Louisiana. And it was my pickup truck that he had left in. And so they had dug through the glove box and they found Nelda's phone number. I don't know why Nelda's phone number was in the glove box, but that's who they called. So Nelda called my dad. We called the farmer. We ended up going to Bunkie and getting the truck. And that left him afoot. And that changed the dynamic one more time. Talk about angry. He now was angry because he didn't have his transportation. We had it. He didn't know we had it, but he knew it was gone. And so he was afoot. That leads up to March the 18th, 2002. When we talk about the God moments in this whole thing, Jill called me out of the sky blue and asked me to do March. I mean, March? Okay, sure, we'll do March. And Heart to Heart is always the first Tuesday of the month. Every year at the hospital, we have a mandatory meeting for all employees. There is no getting out of it. Everybody goes. It is always on the first Tuesday of March. But this year, because we had leap year, Terry decides it might be fun to do it on leap year. So he books it on leap year. And so I booked Heart to Heart. Well, then about 3 or 4 weeks after I booked Heart to Heart, Terry changes his mind and decides to move it back to the first Tuesday. And I forgot that I told Jill that I would come to Heart. So we start planning this meeting. And 2 weeks ago, it dawns on me, oh, no, I have double booked. So I called Terry and I said, Terry, what do you need me to do? And he said, I need you to go to Heart. He said, you can't not do that. You have to go do it. And I said, okay. I said, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go set up for Heart at 2 o'clock, and then I'm going to come back to Mount Pleasant, and I'm going to be in Mount Pleasant until 5:30, and then I'm going to roll in there on 2 wheels and be ready to speak. And so that was the plan. until lightning struck the First Baptist Church. I can't make this up. Struck the First Baptist Church in Mount Pleasant 2 weeks ago and knocked out all of their audio-visual equipment. And they were going to have to change some kind of transformer on the outside of the church. And Terry said, we're not going to add stress to them having to have this meeting for us. We're going to move our meeting. And so cleared it so that I was focused and ready to be here tonight. So, God is in all of these things. And you can't get away from the miracles that happen throughout the story. But on the night of March the 18th, 2002, someone that morning had spotted this guy down not far from my house. And it was a neighbor I didn't know, but she told a neighbor. And that neighbor's son was dating my cousin at the time. And somehow or another, that all got back to my uncle. This took all day for all this to travel through a small community. So my uncle drove down to the first person that had started all of this with a picture and said, "Was this the guy?" And she said, "Yep, that was him." So the cops are now on this. They know he's down there. He's afoot. We're going to catch him. And they had night vision, and they was going to use their night vision. So it's going to wait till it got dark. So let's go out and hunt him in the woods, And so when I got home from work on March the 18th, you couldn't hardly park in my mother's yard. There were cop cars everywhere. And by 6:45, there wasn't anybody left but my car and my car and the car of the head investigator for the whole case decided that he was going to stick around for a little while just to see what happened. So there was only 2 cars left in our driveway. The investigator happened to drive a car the same color and about the same shape as my mother's. So it looked like the only people parked in my driveway were me and Mom. The last person to leave that night was my uncle. And he looked at my mom and he said, "I don't know why, but I feel like right now if I whistled, he could hear me." And Mom said, "Well, that's just kind of scary." And he said, "Yeah, it kind of is." But he went home. And we had already decided we were going to Barry's that night to spend the night. That's what we were going to do. Dad was out of town. He was in Little Rock. He had done a U-turn in Little Rock with a trailer, and he was on his way home. But we were going to go to Barry's. Then the police officer decides that he's just going to stay to see what happens. And we're like, well, if he's going to stay, we'll just stay here with him. So Mom's chicken fried steak, because she's going to feed this officer. I mean, it's what we do, right, as Baptists, is we feed people. And so she's chicken fried steak in the kitchen, and I'm in the back room talking to a friend of mine from work who had also offered us a place to stay that night. And so I had called her to tell her that we weren't coming, that we had this guy here going to stay. And the doorbell rang. So Mom comes out of the kitchen. Our front door comes into the dining room. And the police officer had been sitting at the dining room table. And Mom comes in and looks out through the glass in the front door and says, "That's him." And the officer stands up and says, "Open the door." So my mom opened the door. And as she opened the door, my husband stepped in the front door. And he said, "John, you're under arrest." And he raised and cocked a .22 pistol at that police officer. And my mother turned and ran. And that police officer jumped over a chair and fired 2 shots while he was in the air before he hit the floor. He hit him once in the head and once in the chest. He was dead before he hit the floor. Mom ran, heard shots. I'm in the back room, heard shots. We had seen nothing. The only gun my mom had seen was John's. She meets me in the hall, pushes me into a bedroom. We were armed. We were ready. At no point up to this point had I ever been scared. And I was thinking about that on the way down here, and because Mom and I laugh and say we were oblivious and maybe just a little naive. We really never thought he would hurt us. And what my thought was on the way down here and what she read in that scripture was it may have just been the peace that passes all understanding. Because we really never were afraid. We were aggravated. We were tired. We were stressed out. I felt like my life was over. But we were not scared. till the shots were fired. And I'm going to tell you, there was some fear that night. So we were armed. We were ready. My mom's not always the most outgoing person that you will meet, but I remember looking at her that night and knowing, as she stood with a rifle in her hand, that there was no doubt in my mind that if he walked through that door, she would be able to take care of what she had to take care of. And the best thing I could do was get out of the way. So I went in the bathroom, and that's where we waited. Now, when we tell this story and when we talk about it between ourselves, it takes us a long time to tell it. And we think about how long it was that we sat in that bedroom and we waited. It probably wasn't 45 seconds. I mean, really, everything happens very fast, but time stood still for us that night. But we're sitting there and we're waiting and we're waiting and we're hearing nothing else. And all of a sudden, the officer calls down the hall. Smartest move that officer ever made, because if he had opened that door, I'm not sure what would have happened to him that night. But he called down the hall, called our names, and he opened the door and was looking down the barrel of my mother's gun. And I remember him telling her, Paula, put the gun down. And she did. And then he told her, take your hands off of it. And she did. And I looked at him and I said, is it over? And he said, yes, it's over. And I said, is he dead? Because over could mean a lot of things. And he looked at me and said, yes, he's dead. He secured the scene, told us to stay put. Once the scene was secured and the other officers got there, they sent the officer in to sit with us because he no longer could be a part of the investigation that was going on. So we're sitting in this room in a very awkward silence when my mother decides to make conversation. And if you know my mom, that's not exactly her lot in life either, but we're sitting there and she says, do you have a wife? And he said, yes, ma'am, and a baby on the way. And she said, well, does somebody need to call her? And he said, no, they've taken care of that. So then there's another silence, and she says, are you a Christian? And he says, yes, I'm a deacon at the First Baptist Church. So once again, with a God moment, we had a Christian officer in our house that night with laser point accuracy. And he will tell you, if he was here standing beside me tonight, that he didn't have that kind of accuracy, especially not in a situation like that. He had never fired his weapon in the line of duty, ever. Had been on the force for years. But the one time he did, it was an absolutely perfect shot. When everything kind of started to happen after that, because, I mean, there were still lots of things that had to happen in my house that night. The Texas Ranger showed up. Now, when they show up, everything changes. Everybody's authority now is gone, and he is the guy. And everybody knows he's the guy. And when he walked in the house, the first thing he did was gather up every officer there in my hallway. And we could hear. We weren't out there, but we could hear. He had prayer with those officers. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that that's the first thing he did. So now we've got a Christian Ranger to go with my Christian officer that we had that night. My dad gets home in the middle of all of this. The officer said, let's give him a minute with his family. Didn't have to do that. We weren't supposed to be in the same room at that point in time, but he gave us a minute with him so that we could, have a minute for us to know that we were okay. God moments. We had a weenie dog. And the whole thing, some of you may be going, oh, the dog. The dog. Dog was pretty special. The dog was at the front door when the doorbell rang. The dog ran between the man's feet as the shots were being fired and didn't get hit. And then we couldn't find the dog, but then come to find out my uncle had got there and had picked the dog up and put him in his car. I mean, everything was taken care of. There wasn't a detail left undone. Everything was perfect. And we couldn't have orchestrated this any better. In Luke 8, the story of Jesus calming the storm happens. Luke 8:22 says, One day Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into the boat and they set out. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waters, and the storm subsided, and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" We were in the biggest storm of our lives. 28 days, the biggest storm of our lives. And all of a sudden, Jesus wakes up and decides to calm the storm. I'm 22 years old, staring down the barrel of a divorce, feeling like my life is over, knowing that best case scenario with the justice system in our nation, he might be gone 10 years. It was all paper crime. He hadn't hurt anybody. So he had had some extra theft that we had picked up along the way. He still wasn't going long. 10 years, and I was going to be looking over my shoulder every time I went to Walmart. I was never going to be free of this guy. And I felt like my life was over. And in an instant, I was free. In my wildest dreams, I never prayed that the man would die. I mean, even I didn't go that far. I mean, I couldn't imagine that God would just take him out. And all of a sudden, I was staring at a life that looked totally different than it did 24 hours earlier because of all these little things that had lined up. My mom has always told me, for as long as I can remember, pray and pray specifically, but know that God may answer in a way that you can't even imagine. That what he has planned may be so far beyond what you can dream up. Don't ever not give him the room to give you something far beyond what you want or what you ask for. And that's what we got. We got the opportunity to truly start clean. A few years later, I met another guy. And I dumped all this on him on date one. And told him that I was going to need his driver's license number and his social security number before he could have date two. And he gave it to me. And I ran it. And he was clean. So it was all good. But I got a second chance at life. I got a husband. I got a beautiful little girl that's more than I could have ever imagined and more than I could have ever dreamed of. And yes, I've had to share this story with her. I've had to tell her about this part of my life that happened, thank goodness, before she was even born. So there was no part of this that has anything to do with her. But it is a part of my life, and it's a lesson that I've learned. And it's something that, I carry with me every day. There's hope. No matter what your storm is, there's hope. They say sometimes God calms the storm and sometimes he lets the storm rage and he comforts his child. I'm going to tell you, he did both with us. I mean, there were times when I thought, why are we still having to deal with this? But really, he had such a plan and everything was laid out in such a perfect way. All the players in this story are still very much a part of my life. The officer, shortly after all of this went through and went down, he decided to resign. Decided that he had kids and a wife, and this was not the life that he wanted to do, not the career for him. So he quit. Went to be a ranch manager. He chose a much calmer way for a while. Wound up as a special ranger for the Texas Ranger investigating cattle theft for a while, and is now a school resource officer in Sulphur Bluff. And so if you happen to know Tony Hurley and you want to shake his hand someday and say thank you, you can get in line behind me. But he's definitely he was our angel that night, and He came and sat on my mom's porch after it all went over, and he told my mom that he was going to resign. And Mom looked at him and she said, I don't know where God intends for you to be tomorrow, but I know where he intended you to be on March the 18th. So, as you think about the storms in your life, look for the ways that God shows up in a way that there's just no doubt it was him. And I'll admit, a lot of those come in hindsight. When you're in the middle of the storm, you're just looking for a way to wake up Jesus, because those disciples, they had the Savior of the world in the boat with them, but they thought they were fixing to drown. And we have the Savior of the world in the boat with us too. And sometimes we still feel like we're going to drown. Don't forget to wake up Jesus. Pray about everything. And don't forget to thank him for his answers.